Hey, it's Dr. Mick. I just want to wrap everything up in the unparalleled evils of cannabis and talk about some legal issues. I don't have perfect answers for this. Obviously, I've done a lot of stuff in one direction. Let's just take a look at the options. Truth be told, the negative legal consequences related to cannabis are markedly worse than any of the health consequences we've documented. I know I didn't get into the psychotic stuff, and I've been critical of that psychosis literature. Yeah, if you got a schizophrenic identical twin, don't smoke pot. But we're talking about a disorder that's got a 1% base rate across the country, and I think we can sidestep that problem. We certainly don't need to throw people in jail in order to make that happen. And depending upon where you live, you really need to know your own law. So Rosalie Pacula had a paper out basically showing that people who lived in decrim places didn't understand decrim. Folks don't know their own laws, and they're enforced in different ways in different states in the U.S. It's just important to know that. If you are purchasing cannabis at a dispensary, by all means, understand what's going on if you take it to a different state afterwards. Always buy in a safe place. If you have less than 1 ounce in a lot of states, that makes a big difference. If you have a friend to pay you back and just you say, well, I didn't make any money on it or anything, you're still dealing. That's just bad business. That doesn't mean you didn't have the intention to distribute. So please understand that. Multiple baggies can mean intention to distribute. A friend of mine in Oklahoma, ate a peanut butter sandwich every day for lunch and threw the bags underneath his car seat, and he was found with all these plastic bags, and they said intention to distribute, which I assure you, nobody wants to buy cannabis in a bag full of peanut butter and jelly, but that did happen. If you work for reform for this issue or any issue really, the world gets better. If you work for peace, you guys probably, some of you don't remember a time when the U.S. wasn't at war, but we're a lot nicer then, and people seem to get along just fine. I do want to underscore that legal sources minimize exposure to hard drugs, as we saw comparing uh, some data from Amsterdam to San Francisco when San Francisco still had prohibition. Craig Reinerman showed that essentially, if you separate cannabis from the hard drug market, people are just less likely to use hard drugs. So the cannabis users in Amsterdam were less likely to use hard drugs than cannabis users in San Francisco. So just looking across time under different mayors in New York City, we do see cannabis busts are a different priority for different people. I'm not sure how to explain this exactly, but truth be told, I think some mayors make this more of a priority than others. And this disparity has been around for a while, but it looks like things really got bad late 1980s, where all of a sudden the disparity on drug arrests per 100,000 was just so much higher for blacks than for whites. And I'm not exactly sure what the mechanism is. When you look at police placement, basically, do they get put in different neighborhoods? Yes, that's definitely a contribution. It doesn't seem to account for everything when you covary some of that out. And then internationally, these were the most recent data I could have, but it's still the case even in 2020. The US incarceration rate is always right around 700 per 100,000 for an alarming amount of time, basically since like 1975. And from 1925 to 1974, it was literally 100 per 100,000. And then what are the countries that are like ours? Well, Rwanda, Russia, Brazil, again, not even coming close, but those are sort of next in line. And you'll see Canada's still right around that 100 per 100,000 as it has been for a long, long time. And yet their crime rates are pretty much the same as ours. So crime rates have gone down since, the 90s, but crime rates have gone down worldwide since the 90s. It just makes me wonder how much of an impact is this really having? And how much does crime have to do with policy in general? I should emphasize too that the prisons in different countries are just dramatically different from each other. So a prison in Germany looks like a nice junior college dorm. I hate to say it. And the prisons in the US simply don't. They have, each person has his or her own cell. You have your own bathroom. You cook your own food. It's just a very different model. And it seems that their crime rates are also markedly lower than ours, and they imprison maybe, 1/9 as many people as we do per 100,000. I'm I'm befuddled. Jeff Rosen has a talk on this, a TED talk on YouTube with Germany in the title, if you want to get into some of that. Well, when we look back on how did cannabis become illegal in the first place, it's pretty heartbreaking. You'd think, oh, there were some data and people were concerned and stuff like that. Truth be told, alcohol prohibition had just been repealed. Anslinger was pushing the Marijuana Tax Act, which passed in 1937. And if you take a test in my class, that's a number worth knowing. But based on just all this racist overgeneralizing, and then you read the transcripts from the congressional meetings, and they're saying things like marijuana, I think it's a narcotic of some kind. The bird seed crew tried to argue against it. Partly marijuana was not a word then, so people didn't realize they were talking about cannabis, and some physicians came and essentially argued against it, but they just passed it, and nobody really knew what they were talking about. And then John Ehrlichman, who worked for Nixon when we really first coined the whole war on drugs expression, said flat out they were going to make cannabis illegal and crack down on heroin as well, just to make sure Democrats weren't able to vote. Like, I'm not even sure how else to frame it. So in the new Jim Crow, folks have pointed out some pretty startling statistics on this. Disproportionately harms the poor and communities of color. So obviously the rates of incarceration are different in different neighborhoods. And part of it is too, the rearrest is such an issue. So if you leave a federal prison with a felony, you've got essentially no access to public housing. You don't have an ID. It's hard to get a job. You don't have an ID anyway. How are you going to make money? How are you going to find a place to stay? I mean, unless you've got a really generous set of friends or family, it's going to be pretty tough to pay any kind of bills in order to stay afloat. So yeah, nearly 80% of the people in federal prison and 60% of people in state prison for drug offenses are African American or Latino. And then correctional facilities worsen drug user health and drug use disorders, making returning citizens far more likely to experience overdose, and I should emphasize relapse, right? So yes, you can get drug treatment at some prisons, but not all of them. And the decision about where to send you is usually just about how dangerous do you seem, not how do we rehabilitate you. And I'm afraid that focus is kind of lost. So we need to just do a better job. And then Edward Shepard from Lemoyne had at least a 3-paper set basically suggesting that if you're going to spend law enforcement time on arresting people for possession of cannabis, obviously that's time that law enforcement can't devote to other crimes. Grabbing somebody with an eighth and taking them down to the station and fingerprinting them, all these other things could be happening at the same time. So he documented that if there were more cannabis arrests, we also saw increases in homicide, burglary, motor vehicle theft, and larceny. These are real problems. Like, this is not, oh, we just didn't write some traffic tickets. Now, this isn't replicating everywhere, and Kevin Sabet was ribbing me about this, so I'm not sure what's going on. If you're in law enforcement and have any idea why this isn't continuing to work, I'd really love your input. Part of the issue seems to be, too, that you get more toys if you can do a big drug bust and then basically steal people's stuff. Because it may have been ill-gotten gains. So then suddenly, the cop shop has a new tank to play with or something. And then Ted also showed basically that having medical marijuana laws not only didn't increase property crime, which was something everybody feared, but he documented significant drops in rates of violent crime, at least on the West Coast. And this also is not replicating with the effect sizes I had hoped. So this is not necessarily a compelling argument for changing cannabis laws. I know folks like to get into, but what about the money that you raise and could it go this way? And I unfortunately just don't have a good feel for that. I'm not a big fan of always earmarking tax money for one thing or another. So we'll have to see. But yes, Colorado suddenly has more money than it did a few years ago. California certainly has the ability to fund some cannabis research that it couldn't fund before. We don't want to just say, hey, well, we're going to do it because we're going to raise money, but that is how alcohol prohibition got repealed. And then the dreaded, what about the children? So, everybody was concerned this sends the wrong message to kids, and maybe they're going to start using drugs, not take marijuana as seriously, etc. As you might guess, I want to focus more on problems than I do on actual use. And truth be told, if my daughter saw me showing the slide, God only knows what would happen. So what about the children? I appreciate Paul Armentano from NORML has set me up with some of this, and I'm really grateful to him. But back in the day, what we noticed is use does not co-vary with laws much. So if you do decrim, you don't see a ton of change. If you do medical cannabis, you don't see a ton of change. With the tax and regulate data, you are seeing more people use, and the rates of problems, depending on whose data you look at, either stay the same or rise a little bit. It does seem like, not the effect we necessarily wanted, but as going through some of these other videos, it's not clear that just plain old use really is a negative. So let's keep that in mind. And then the tacit assumption for, making harsh penalties was it was going to either decrease availability or increase fear of punishment in an effort that would at least keep kids away, if not keep everybody away. So when you do polls of teenagers and say, hey, you use cannabis, why? You get an interesting set of responses about cannabis expectancies, some more accurate than others. You also get a feel for the folks who say, no, I'm not going to use cannabis, and ask them why. Getting arrested is never in the top 5 and rarely in the top 10. So on these data, it says fear of getting arrested was number 9 of the 17 that they listed. But what really is it? I don't feel like getting high. I think my parents would disapprove. I'm just not interested, or I'm worried about negative health effects. And those are, reasonably data-based concerns. So by all means, I commend them for that. But take-home messages, they really don't fear arrest. In all honesty, I don't know when the last time you talked to a teenager was, but they don't think anything bad is going to happen to them. So it's clearly not having the deterrent effect we wanted. And then now everything's confounded with the availability of a tax and regulated market, but the price was not dramatically altered in response to arrests. My student Maha has some data we're collaborating on that suggests it doesn't seem to really change use even today, having more arrests. So it's just not clear that this policy is making that much of a difference. When you compare the US to countries like the Netherlands, where cannabis was markedly more available. We're not seeing uh, data to suggest that teens there are more likely to use than teens here, except that they have a little ritual at 18, much like the one we have at age 21 with alcohol. And then I gotta be candid, it's not altering availability for kids either. So the last CASA survey, 40% of teens say that they can obtain marijuana within a day. One quarter say they can obtain marijuana within 1 hour. I gave a talk just as a joke at a high school, and I said, if I offered $1,000 for an ounce of pot right now, I bet you guys would make it happen. And then I realized, oh my God, I don't want to say that. Like, people were heading for the door, right? It's just not a difficult task for most teenagers in most public high schools. And then, depending upon whom you ask, the increase in availability from 2000 to 2008 was pretty stark. And then finally, when you keep asking year after year after year, only 7% of high school seniors stated lack of availability was a relevant reason for not using cannabis or stopping their cannabis use. So apparently, we can't legislate our way out of this one. I gotta be mindful of the fact that I've had prison guards say, "Look, we've got pot in jail. Like, this prison has drugs coming in, and it's a prison. Like, this is the most guarded building, in the country or in the state or something like that, and yet drugs get in. So I don't think, unless we're going to make every school like a prison, which sounds really dreadful, we're not going to be able to just keep cannabis away." And then I'm on radio shows where guys say things like, "We need to cut it out with a knife," and I don't understand what that means. This is a weed that grows. Like, it's not going to just disappear the way the dodo went or something. And if you'll indulge me for a minute, I just want to talk about the Portugal experience, because they decriminalized personal amounts in 2001 of all drugs. And in the year 2000, we heard they were going to do this, but we didn't hear all the details. And so I still lived in California then, and we were still hashing out some things with medical cannabis. I was super apprehensive about this, and everybody said, hey, there's going to be drug tourism, and everything is going to go off the rails. But at the time, they had literally 1% of the population was shooting heroin. Like, man, that is rough. So they had to try something new. What we didn't hear about was they also had job placement, counseling, right? So people didn't go to jail, but it's not like they just got a ticket and walked away. They ended up going to a program where they got treatment for drug problems if that was appropriate, and got set up with job training, got job placement, counseling, all these other things that cost money but paid off in the long run, because now their lethal overdose rate is markedly smaller. The number of teen users there is pretty much towards the low end of all the rest of European Union. It's just not the problem that it once was. So, I mean, people do let's compare and contrast the US to Portugal, and some of these are not exactly invariant, but okay, yeah, the US spends $1 trillion. We're a bigger country. That's not a fair comparison. But police are definitely more likely to focus on solving violent crimes in Portugal. They don't have to send a SWAT team in to bust a house. They've got 4 times fewer murders and 7 times fewer rapes than the US. That's pretty astounding. Their current drug use is about half of what ours is. And then they spend a ton on drug programs that help users and help folks find jobs. What you don't hear about much is the methadone van comes out every day. So all these guys are working construction out somewhere, and it's lunchtime, and here comes the methadone van, and everybody runs and gets a sandwich and gets their methadone. And it takes, 45 seconds for them to flash their card and get their little cup and swallow it down and head back to work. I'm eager to have that going here in the US, but whew, man, that's going to take a big conversation. So here's some data just trying to emphasize that Portugal really is doing markedly better. So their drug-induced deaths are way down. HIV cases, so they've got about 10 million people living there, and we're at 1,400. They were at 400 in 2006. It's pretty much between 300 and 400 every year since then. The number of court cases obviously is way down. The number of treatment admissions is obviously way up because that's their new focus now. And all in all, their drug use rate is less not only than ours, but also the United Kingdom, Italy, Germany. It's something's really working with this approach. Now they only have 10 million people. Maybe that's part of it. But why can't we do this? I'm not sure. So I've got data on drug use basically for the first 5 years, and we saw in the high school kids, literally everything they measured was down and kept seem to apply for lifetime use. And compared to other countries in the European Union, for general population 15 to 64, use of cannabis across a lifetime was the lowest in 2005. What can I say? It's pretty much always in those bottom 4 or 5, and yet it's completely decriminalized as far as possession of personal amounts of anything. With this in mind, then, it looks like teens do not use cannabis because they just can't get it because of the drug war, or because it's too expensive because of the drug war, or because they're afraid they're going to get arrested because of the drug war. So I'm not clear what that impact is. Throwing everybody in jail doesn't seem to be helping relative to treatment in other countries. Why don't we open our minds to this? Even just decriminalizing everywhere would be a step in that right direction. If this is something that could mean something to you, by all means, send me an email. Go to normal.org, mpp.org, or my friends at Drug Policy Alliance, dpa.org, and see if anything there kind of resonates. Here's a link to that pretty fun legal theory about this. You can obviously get more info in any of my books, or some books that are even more focused on legal issues. If you haven't read The New Jim Crow, I really do recommend it. I think that's enough, and I appreciate everybody tuning in. If you have any questions, email me at 420research@gmail.com, or just put something underneath this video.